Today we are chatting with Atla, the writer of Wooden Bones. Um, Atla, do you want to give a little hello, introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, my name's Atla. I am one of the editors at Hiveworks and also a comics writer. And I currently made Wooden Bones, where I wrote it with the lovely Alexandra Dumadankai. Um, and I also run, or am the chairman, active chairman of the Icelandic Comic Society, which I also co-founded, which I work on it as my day job, and then my seedy night job is going to the or to Hive and just being like, haha, what's going on, you guys? And then we talk about comics, and then they pay me. It's lovely.
It's a really good setup that you have. So I've got a couple topics that we could talk about. We could talk about Wooden Bones, which obviously I want to talk about that so bad. Um, we can talk about you as a writer and how it is to write comics. And we can talk about comic society. So I guess I kind of want to be a little open-ended here and let you take the lead. Um, we were talking about the comic society stuff and like working with younger generations before we went live here. Um, but I think that I want to talk about how that feels to bring together older and younger generations through comics.
Hmm.
Um, and specifically like older and younger generations of queer people through comics, because I feel like that is that's something that we talk a lot about. I think as a community is like the separation between older generations of queer people and younger generations of queer people. But
Hmm.
you hang out with kids all day talking about gay stuff and comics, and I think that that's so important. Do you want to talk a little bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's interesting that you would say, younger and older generation of queer people in regards to the comic society and how we bring those folks together, because, like, the reality is that most of the quote, older generation that's doing comics in Iceland, they're about 35, 42 at maximum, right? Like these are the old guard are not that old.
Mhm.
Um, so when we're talking about like generational bridging, like between people, we're usually talking about the kids that are my age and like the teens of today, rather than specifically those like older folks. Because there's certainly older queer folk here in Iceland, but there's not a lot of older comics creators here, which is
Yeah,
the bigger issue, right?
yeah, I
Um,
think that's true. Comics is like a young person's game. It's so demanding.
it really is. I am 25. My body feels like it's 42. Um, we were talking about it before the stream. I was like, I'm gonna take a nap after this.
Yeah, you
Um,
were saying, "Oh, I'm so tired. I'm so tired." I was like, "What time is it in Iceland?" And you're like, "Oh, it's 5 o'clock in the
it's
evening."
5 o'clock and I need a nap. Um, to be fair, like I'm doing, this month alone, I'm doing 2 week-long workshops. So it's not like I'm not putting in a lot of time and a lot of effort, but my body is
Absolutely.
definitely, yeah, like my body's definitely like, oh, you're reaching your mid 20s, and you've worked it like you're in your mid 30s. So, I'm gonna start messing with you now, and then suddenly you're just like, ah, I can't stand up or go biking for 8 hours like I used to. But
Yeah.
now I gotta hold my hand up and like assist myself while I fucking get up from the kitchen.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. I mean, you introduced yourself in the kind of work that you do, um, which to me and to a lot of people I think sounds like a dream. Like you get to do comics stuff all day. Like who doesn't want to do that? Um, I say as a comics person, but the reality is that comics, whether you are doing like community work or actively writing at your desk all day or drawing or whatever it is, it's a physical job, in
Mhm.
addition to, like, the mental toll that it takes on a person. So, that actually does tie into I'm curious, about your process of working on Wooden Bones as a writer, like, you have an additional, pair of hands to help you create this piece. I think that often in webcomics, especially, the writer and the artist are one person, and that,
Mhm.
that's why a lot of webcomics, take so long, go unfinished, uh,
Mhm.
it's just such a strain. So, I'm interested in your experience of being a writer artist duo and coming to create this piece with a second set of hands, a second brain. How was that for you?
Well, so Alexandra, who drew it, came up to me once and was like, "Hey, do you want to make a comic?" And I was like, "Ah." And she was like, "Yeah, we've got this like these anthologies. I might want to submit it to." And I'm like, "Cool, let's do that." And that didn't quite pan out, which is fine. And I was like, I know people in Hive because I'm a person in Hive. And she's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, I might be able to get this at least on the store and maybe get us a little bit of funding through that. And so we originally crafted the comic from just like I was like, what do you want to make? And that's often how I do my comics because like writers have an interesting liability that artists don't have, which is that as a duo, as part of a duo, they cannot be like without another artist, right? Like Alexandra could come up to me and be like, "I'm gonna make my own comic unrelated to you," and then she could go do that, and she has, right? She's drawn and written her own pieces. Unless I pick up a pencil and scribble something together that looks like a 5-year-old made it, I cannot make a separate like an entire comic on my own. Like it inherently has to have another individual, which always makes it harder to finance, harder to make work, like so there's always those interesting elements of it that make it a little bit more of a risk for the writer. Just like financially, right? Like workload wise, the artist is still taking the majority of the hours, but like it's still very very expected for the writer to pay for the process of kind of crafting the idea and the stories and if it's a longer project, it's kind of the writer's responsibility to be like, all right, where do we want to submit this and making sort of a game plan. So from like a pre-production perspective, there's a lot of workload that goes into it. And if the artist bails and says like I'm kind of outy, and you've got to think like, all right, now I got to get a new artist. Now I got to get like there might be different rates, there might be more or less. Um, and so it all kind of comes into a little jumble that makes it difficult for writers to make like larger projects on average. Because like if a writer or if an artist says like all right I'm done, they can come back to the project because they are both the primary writer and the primary artist, so they can't
Right.
always come back and be like all right it's been 10 years and I shelved this but I'm gonna restart it or continue it or maybe reboot the project or whatever. Well you always have to come in with different people, and that means that like shorter projects are a lot easier to do, a lot easier to finance, and a lot easier to work with. And so I was like, all right, you want to make a story? I want to make a story. And I had been doing my first round of pitches for one of my comics, and just the experience. There was a different experience between like the amount of work between because Alexandra is a friend of mine. Right. We met on DeviantArt, as many old gays meet on DeviantArt.
Naturally. Naturally. What year? Can I ask?
I don't. I think like 2012, 2013, something like that.
Impeccable.
Yeah, like right at the death throes of the heyday of DeviantArt.
Yeah, the dark ages of DeviantArt.
Yes. Um, and so like the difference between trying to kind of navigate this like publishing world where it's like, hey, you know, you gotta get this 200-page graphic novel, you gotta get this, like, you gotta probably get an agent, you probably gotta get, like, these things, there's gonna be production troubles, there's gonna be, like, a big publisher, there's a lot of big money behind it, like, there's a lot of things and nuances to consider, and there, even once a deal might be struck, a lot of stuff might go wrong, versus two friends making a comic and then seeing if they can find a home for it. It's night and day, basically. And I've
Absolutely.
discovered yeah, and I've discovered that these sort of shorter projects felt good. They felt rejuvenating in a way. They I was like, all right, like at the end of the day, you know, like it might not be a bestseller or it might not be like in every store, but I still finished it and I can come back to it and redo it or like repackage it or republish it whenever. Um, and that's why part of why um this story is about sort of taking a look at yourself and reanalyzing your priorities. And I had just started transitioning at the time. I had figured out I was trans for quite a while, but I had not transitioned in the medical sense until that point.
Mhm.
And I was going through a lot of like, you know, what trans people often go through, this sort of self-doubt and
Yeah.
sort of like, what do I is this really gonna be good? Is this gonna, you know, like I had thought about 100 different ways for me to come out as a trans person within the comics community. And at the time when I was starting in comics, 2013, there were two very fundamental truths, one of which was if you're a trans person, you know, like trans narratives are just not, were not really accepted in 2013. Like, at least not on like a global market scale.
Right.
Um,
Right. I know myself, I 2013, I was just in college. I think I had found out what trans people were like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you know? And I think a lot of
exactly.
people are in the same boat. So totally that vibe of the era.
Yeah, and so it like I would say anyone who started out that point, 2013 till now, has gone through so many radical changes. I think more than almost any decade in comics where we've had, of course, like social movements that have managed to push trans rights in a couple of different directions, many very, very positive, some recent ones not very positive at all. Um, and we've on top of that had, you know, like this revitalization not only like of web comics, but also we've had the interest of like big graphic novel publishers, like the basic things that you started doing in 2013, 2014, and how you expected to form your career and what was expected of you, and when you could come out and how you could come out and what you could do with coming out as a creator, were just fundamentally different. Like I had imagined myself basically working until I was 30 and very successful in comics and doing all these cool things, and then I could safely come out. I thought of
Right.
like the career as almost like a shield, right?
Mm.
And so by the time when Bones happens, you know, idea wise, it's about 2019, and I'm starting my medical transition, you know, starting these hormones. And on top of that, the scene, like I was coming to terms with the fact that very quickly the publishing industry was moving in a direction that I had trouble keeping up with as somebody who lived like very far away from the whole scene. Like outside of emails and streams, there's not a whole ton of ways for me to access um, the American publishing scene.
Right, right.
And so it was making new demands like, hey, we not only aren't against trans narratives, but we want them. And sort of the underlying tone for a few kind of conversations in publishing that I've personally overheard is like we kind of expect it now. And
Mm,
at the same time, there's not only globally, but just like overall, like transphobia has gone in many different directions. Some really positive, like people have become a lot more tolerant, and trans rights are becoming a much bigger and more vocal issue to discuss. And at the same time, there's a lot of terrifying legislation in the U.S.
yeah,
Going on
yeah.
right now.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so Wooden Bones is about sort of my mindset in that space. You know, it's about burnout. It's about uh, kind of understanding that you're in a transitional period, both metaphorically and literally, and that you're maybe at a low point, which is the work or build up to the kind of high of being where you want to be, and kind of struggling with that waiting period.
Yeah.
And as like I went through, I was talking about the graphic novel business, and like like pitched that, and I had like an agent, and it went pretty. It flopped a little bit, like it was difficult to sell. A lot of publishers were not interested, and so like as I went through my transition and through my like career in terms of writing, that story became more meaningful to me on a personal level. So even though I wrote it from like this perspective of just transitioning, it became more important to me on like that sort of personal, sort of just like how my mindset was and is, and how it's changed over the years, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I really liked when I was reading Wood and Bones was there what's the line? Hang on, I'm gonna look this up really quick. Uh oh, the line recline failure always feels comfortable when you're in the middle of doing something worthwhile.
Yeah.
That really stuck to me. That idea
Mm-hmm.
of like what I'm doing is so big and so important to who I am as a person that it's intimidating and it's scary, and it's like, well, what if I just like completely fuck it up? I
Mm-hmm.
why bother? I should just, retreat and forget about it.
Yeah. That line specifically, I like read it several times like it was a fucking note to myself from the past, right? Like where I was like, yeah, past me, you're right. I I should stop being a little baby about this.
Yeah, yeah, that's the best part about writing anything, right? Is that like when you look back on your work, you're like, "Damn, past me was on something." Like that was smart.
That was an idea, and I rolled with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very. I would say it's probably my most personal work, because a lot of the times I make work that's or write from a perspective of like what's it like to see the other side? What's it like to, come to terms with the fact that you might be wrong, or that you might have a different perspective than others? But it's very rare for me to go into these sort of like introspective works. They're usually, if we analyze what I'm writing, and like what group of people I'm writing and stuff like that, it's usually not tied heavily to my personal identity. And I again, it has to do with that like 2013 we had bestseller comics that were overtly transphobic. Like
Mhm.
So I was very discouraged to write trans narratives, and the people that wrote trans narratives at the time, bless their hearts, I went through shit. Like
Hmm.
while it's certainly within those groups that tend to harass marginalized folks, while it's certainly kind of out of vogue now to a degree, I remember seeing certain trans creators in comics who would just sort of have public meltdowns
Hmm.
because they were being like fucked with on a
Yeah.
daily basis.
Hmm.
And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want to go through with that. And then I went through that anyway because I talked about not telling the Thundercats Roar people to fuck off, like directly telling the staff members to fuck off, and people were like, "How dare you? I will tell them to fuck off if I want to." I was like, I mean, I'm just saying, if you want a job in the animation industry, you shouldn't insult specifically the creators. You can insult the show all you want, but you don't need to insult like the people behind it. And they were like, "You're censoring me. I'm putting this on Comicsgate." I was like, "I'm sorry.
Oh
Hello."
no. Oh no.
So
God.
that was.
Comicsgate.
I mean, it was game. I think it was Gamergate, rather, or like the Reddit itself was on Gamergate or whatever. But like, that's when I realized, like, as shitty as it sounds, you're gonna get accosted anyway. Like,
Right. Right.
like I specifically very at that time was like kind of hiding, my age, who I was as a person, like um just just sort of like much of my personal details, because I wanted to appear kind of like the everyman sort of thing where people could just put whatever outside of the basic values I have and the base opinions I have, like they could be like, oh, this person might um this person might be like me in some way. Um,
Yeah, there's like that gray anonymity where you can like be very selective about how much of yourself you put out on the internet. Um,
yeah, and I'd thought of that, and I pushed for that for a long time, and some elements of that I still do. Like I have not updated my profile picture in 75 years, and I never will. Because people really do like forget who you are if you don't have the old profile picture. And I was like,
That's true. That's true.
I
Um,
don't wanna like,
and there's a power in that. There's a power in controlling like how much information people have access about you, you know? Being able
mhm.
to uh control your image in that way is something very specific to the internet. And it's a shield, absolutely, you know. It's a
Yeah.
defense. Yeah.
And so like I realized like, oh, that shield's not gonna do diddly squat. People are gonna put you on blast anyway for
Mhm.
saying not to tell people to fuck off by name because they made a TV show you didn't like. And I'm like, guys. Um so like I learned that. And after that and quite a number of other just personal revelations, I was like, I gotta be true to myself, you know. Not only is it slightly safer in that sense, but it's not at this point it's not unsafer to not do it, right? Like it's not you're not that shield that I tried to put up. It didn't protect me as much as I thought it would. It's still, like I was still gonna get occasionally harassed. I was still gonna have to fucking
Yeah.
block people willy-nilly
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
It's like
So
that false sense of like control. Like as somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and stuff, there's like this thing where you're like, okay, if I do this, if I do XYZ and I can control, these elements of my day-to-day life, then nothing bad will ever happen to me. and I'll be able
Mhm.
to sidestep everything, and, that's not true. Um,
No, yeah.
and, yeah, and I think that oftentimes it does take, like, um, an awakening moment of some kind, of, like, some disaster where it's like, "No, no, no, I controlled everything correctly. I nothing bad should have happened to me," and yet, you know,
Yeah,
uh,
you
and then you wake up and you're like, "Okay, well, might as well just live my life authentically because control is an illusion."
yeah, that's also part of it, is like your sense of control can never beat things like capitalism or some shit,
Yeah, no, it's true.
you're never gonna be able, like the reason you and I are able to write queer narratives for larger publications is strictly because of when we were born. And,
Yeah,
and like
absolutely.
and like also, talented individuals, yada yada. But if we had been born in the 80s, that's what we're not talking about. Like,
Yeah, yeah. I was actually just talking to a friend yesterday. I was like, kinda sucks to be living through the apocalypse right now. Like, it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit in Portland today, and that's unheard of, completely unheard of, ridiculous.
mhm.
And I'm like, "It sucks to be living through the apocalypse right now." And he's like, "Yeah, but at least we have the internet. Can you imagine being alive in the '90s?" And I was like, "Ugh." I mean, I was born in the '90s, but like, no, I don't wanna be creating queer media in the '90s. I would rather be creating queer media right now. Like, this is, I don't know, from my perspective, a much kinder, uh, place to be creating from, and I think part of that is because of the internet. Like, I'm able to talk to you right now all the way in
Yeah,
Iceland because of our online connections, and I think that what you were talking about, creating comics in 2013, not a lot of trans narratives, not a lot of queer narratives, um, and how that's changed. I think that when I think about comics, when I think about my comics community and people, both online and in Portland, in my local IRL hometown, um, they're all queer. Like, I don't think I know a single straight comics creator, and I know they exist. I just, it's kinda like Bigfoot. I'm like, "Really? They exist?" Oh,
they're all writing Captain American. They're
oh, that's
all
right. I I
yeah.
I do not see it. I simply do not see it.
But and that's also, you're right. Like, and as I was dealing with that, like I was dealing with that like loss of my own shield and kind of loss of control, and that was what Wooden Bones, which is also sort of like goes into urban fantasy territory, and has like a demigoddess, and has witchcraft in it. Um, has all these like beautiful watercolor illustrations. I worked in that burnout and elements of burnout, and
Mhm.
I'm currently working on another webcomic with Hive, Gugel Guardian. And I like, as we're talking about this, and we're talking about what's important to me as a storyteller about Wind and Bones, I'm like, oh, those are the exact same things that I like about Gugel Guardian. Like, they're the like it's the same sort of sense of talking about like burnout, recognizing your own limits, recognizing like what's out of your control, and learning to kind of live the best version of your own life and stuff like that. Um, I think that's, as a storyteller, that's something I now that it's kind of safe to do it, I would like to place a lot more emphasis on as a creator moving forward, is like how to deal with the loss of control of your own life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the elements, that goes along with, like, loss of control, in Wooden Bones is, like, this narrative of heartbreak,
Mhm.
um, and, I think that heartbreak can occur to us not just romantically, but also when when you when something fails, when you reach a failure point or a disappointment of some kind, like you have your heart set on something, and it doesn't quite pan out, or there is heartbreak, not just romantically, but also like aspirationally and platonically, um,
Mm-hmm.
and the main character in Wood and Bones encounters this disappointment, this heartbreak, in the pursuit of like her authentic self. And when I think about um, comics and books and stories that are about like heartbreak and loss, it's often like a teen narrative. It's often like, um, like, oh, my boyfriend broke up with me, and it's it's an element of storytelling that I think is very normal for like a cis hetero-centric world, but has a different flavor in queer narratives and in queer experiences. And I'm wondering, like, how do we process heartbreak as queer adults, as queer teenagers? This disappointment that comes along with like becoming who we are and um reaching for that goal.
Mm-hmm. It's it's an interesting question. I certainly don't have the full answer, but I think part of it is recognizing that since you and I, um, in our age bracket makes up most of the current queer comics creators.
Mhm,
And I would say even just like the most of queer creators in general are currently like 20 to 30,
mhm,
due to various reasons, both tragic and reasonable and whatnot. And when we were born, the act of being gay was still a dangerous thing.
mhm.
Of course, it still is. It's still like we have to acknowledge that even something that is now kind of taken for granted as just being a gay dude in public.
Mhm.
Um, there's pockets within every country, not
Right,
just like countries that haven't made legal progress or anything like that. Every country, including the
right.
U.S., Canada,
It's
Iceland.
entirely based on where you are, and sometimes it's just based on the day, like. Mm,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So when we were born, those areas were a lot larger, encompassed a lot more territory. And as we grew older, I would say every 5 years, our understanding of what we were allowed to do as queer people changed on a very fundamental level. And I would say that 5 years from now, up until like 10 years from now, how we understand queer life is just going to be radically different in those
oh,
two
yeah.
interim. And of course, again, territories that still haven't had much luck with legal progress and like all these difficult issues and unique problems that many of these queer groups have to face in other territories. Um, those are still going to be like they're still going to go through that as we maybe stabilize or metastasize in some way. And so like I think acknowledging that is a big part of the process, right?
Mm,
Um, I've talked to you about this privately, where I was like, I've sometimes felt like I was just spinning my wheels and I wasn't getting anywhere because people were getting farther than me, who had been maybe in the game a bit shorter, and that will always happen. It doesn't matter how fast you are at getting quote success. Somebody will always outpace you or be younger than you or whatever. And if it doesn't come now, it'll come later.
yeah.
And then we were talking about it, and I realized like I am probably the first Icelandic person to ever be able to make a living off of comics internationally. Not the first person to make off like an entire living off of it locally, but internationally certainly.
Yeah.
And so like my expectations, like were set so high. My expectations were set on the same exact bar as my American friends who had a lot of different access, who had, access to, I have to imagine in places like Portland, California, and in places like Fort Wayne with C2E2, like there's a lot of resources you can pull through and a lot of people you can talk to and actually in person meet and discuss things and kind of get a lay of the land a lot better. And yet I was beating myself up because even though I didn't have access to any of that, I still should have, quote, like, been better at it and been faster at it and actually, like, reached these very lofty goals. When I had already done things that nobody else in my country has ever done, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so I think queerness is gonna be a bit like that and has been a lot like that. We're gonna have to readjust our expectations of success, and because we are in a world where 10 years ago it would be unthinkable for me to be on this stream, in
Right.
public, talking about transness and talking about being a comics creator. So, like, obviously, my resources are limited, and that fucking sucks, and it's a systemic issue, and it's yada yada yada. Some of it's not exactly systemic with me being in another country, but a lot of it has to do with me being trans and access and yada yada. But, like, at the same time, a single individual is not gonna work through these systemic issues and rise above the tide. And if they are, it usually comes at a great personal cost.
Right.
So, like, we can mourn the fact that we don't have access to these same resources, but we cannot beat ourselves up for not being able to break through this wall, or these systemic issues.
Yeah.
Like, I think that will be sort of a somber thing to learn, will be to kind of like not temper our expectations, but keep in mind that as we progress and as we go through, our lives, our careers, we are doing things that fundamentally none of our peers 30 years ago were fully able to do. And if they were, it was at an intense personal cost. Just in the same way that the people that are breaking the ceiling now are wrecking themselves to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that will cause us to have a little bit more of a better perception of our own understanding of, like, our careers and our lives and what success is to us.
Yeah, I think that concept of redefining what success is in a holistic way that, like, takes into consideration what kind of content we're making and what kind of culture we're up against. Um, I think that that is a really important facet, to being, a queer person and a queer creator, uh, definitely.
Mhm.
And I think that being able to publish online, do indie publishing, do small comics like we were talking about earlier, being able to do shorter stories, that's all really empowering stuff because that is, since we've been making queer stories, telling queer stories generations now, it's always been like a strength that we have community and that we have small independent publishing that we can have access to telling our stories this way. And maybe um maybe we don't need Disney's first gay here character or whatever, maybe
Yeah.
that's not what we need, but maybe what we need is the ability to tell our own narratives to each other, without it being mass marketed and packaged by, like, the mouse or one of the mouse's children.
Mhm. I mean, it's always important to also keep in mind that that's part of the of the systemic issue.
Mm,
There always has been and always will be more queer people working behind the scenes than actually show up. And of course, more that goes for all marginalizations and all, like people of color, disabled people, all of us good folks. Um, there's always more of us behind the scenes than there is on the final product.
Hmm.
And I have both heard from, heard stories of and heard stories from people, have worked at TV production studios and at larger comics publishers, who have had to have very difficult conversations and very, at times, upsetting conversations about uh, how to move diversity forward. And we have to
Hmm.
understand, this goes back to when we were talking about yelling at people for Thundercats Roar. Um, there's probably tons of people who work on these types of shows, or be it Thundercats Roar, be it something like Voltron, which was very public about its behind the scenes shindigs, or be any TV or movie that you have an issue with. There's people behind the scenes who have had those uncomfortable conversations.
Hmm.
Um, how much can we push this? How much can I bring past the censors? Loki usually recently had um, a small moment where he's confirmed as a lover of men. Very nice.
That's right. My
Um,
friend texted me about this and she said, "Look, it's Disney's first gay character."
and and I was like, well, that's nice. Could have been a little bit earlier,
Right.
since Tom Hiddleston has been doing this for like 14 years now.
You're
Um,
telling me a queer coded this villain?
but like like just from knowing how, especially how the mouse works,
Hmm.
every aspect of that queerness and that representation was, like the original way that they probably wanted to do that looked nothing like what we got on screen.
Right.
Like if many of the queer writers that pushed for that had their way, or showrunners, producers, whoever who pushed for that had their way, Tom Hiddleston would probably be making out with a dude on screen. But that's not going to happen, not because the writers don't want to, or Tom Hiddleston doesn't want to. I'm sure he would love to do a scene like that. Um, just to be able to say he did a scene like that, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
not like an openly queer lad. Like,
I
he
think
seems like a dude who would get the kick out of like, oh, after over 10 years, I finally get to take this like very marketable villain and just make out with a man. Whoa.
yeah, totally.
Um, and so like all of those products have within them, those like marketed products have within them those fights or those conflicts or those desires from creators who wish they had done things a bit differently. Um, and that's of course in any teamwork thing. Even when it's wildly successful and according to the creator's vision, there's always people who are like, I wish I had done this or that differently. But especially with companies always wanting to be safe with their queerness and how they portray queerness and how they profit off of queerness.
Right. Yeah. And I
There's,
think at the end of the day, it is about profit, right?
yeah.
uh, yeah. And I think that that is a big difference between working on a big project like that for a big company where the end goal is the bottom line, is the dollar, versus what we can do as independent comics creators. Like you are technically on a team, like the team of you and the artist, whatever project you're working on, but that is, you're both starting on equal footing basically, where you're like, yeah, this is going to be a queer narrative because we're in control of it. And uh, I think that not having to fight to tell your story in that
Mhm,
capacity is really empowering.
mhm. It definitely is. And something we have to keep in mind that as we move forward, and some people will, we will keep moving into this like small press direction, especially as these larger companies and conglomerates start kind of trying to possess stories and characters and concepts and whatnot. Um, because like we think about, a lot of people are like, I wish I could tell these stories at this publisher, or get this amount of money for that publisher, or something like that. But that's only half the story. You know what I mean? Like you and I are on like creator um, like discords and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And the amount of times I hear after, like they're very excited they announce like, hey, I'm at this publisher, uh, and I finally been able to tell the story that I want to tell. Um, there's still that element of like, today my agent said that this person at this company did this thing wrong, and everyone is very mad. Um, so even when people are at this like sort of bottom line process are able to tell their own stories, there is still that corporate mechanism, um, that can, unknowingly or not, mess with kind of what they want to say. Right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, you're attaching your work to basically a brand, basically, some other entity that has a voice, and that voice can package itself around your work, and impact how people view it.
exactly. It's and it's difficult. It's difficult because so many people want and deserve to
Get paid, get
get
money.
paid.
Yeah.
And it's that exchange, right? Are
Yeah.
you ready to sacrifice part of what you want to say? And you
Right.
will. Like, even if it's parts you don't mind, there's still gonna be a little bit of that, like, can we update this a little bit? Can we do this a little bit? And are you willing to do that to get paid? And with that, there's an asterisk there. Asterisk being, even in that case, sometimes you will not actually be paid enough to do the thing.
Yep. Mhm.
So like there's a couple of publishers that uh don't pay well,
Right.
and also make very very big. They're like, hey, we should do this instead of that. So like sometimes it's just better to go through your own channels.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, hey, I I would love for all of us to be able to make our own comics, print them out at home, staple them together like really old school, and just make your rent money off of zines. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, and we do have to go through these channels, if
Mhm.
being an artist is the way that we want to make money, and making comics, being a writer, just in general, being a creator of anything. If that's how you want to make money, you have to sometimes bend to the will of the team that you're working with, whether that's your agent, your publisher, your editor, the
Mhm.
platform that you're posting on, or the credit card processor that you use when people buy your stuff. It's all,
Mhm.
man, we do live in a society, huh?
Yeah, we do that, certainly, for sure. But yeah, exactly. Like you were saying, like, it's not just larger, big corporation publishers or whatever. If you're publishing on webtoons, there's certain things you can't put on there.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, you
like
will
and
have to censor yourself in some capacity there.
yeah, a good chunk of them are censorships you should make. Um, but like they have a couple of very just baseline, like, no, none of this, please.
Yeah, no
Um,
boobies. Can't have it.
yeah, well, like, and even no boobies, like no booby stuff that's like weird as shit and makes people not okay emotionally.
Right. Yeah.
But like, yeah, exactly. Like there's that. you will still have to censor yourself on Kickstarter and on uh,
Patreon, Gumroad,
Patreon.
whatever.
Yeah, regardless of how you're doing that, and even your print shop, if you were just like, I have $1 billion and I'm gonna go to my print shop, you know, while many of them have are just like, I'll publish whatever or print whatever you have, there's limits. There's
Right.
creative limits. Like,
Yeah.
and that doesn't even have to be content wise. That can be like, I remember the creator of Mouse was doing, forget which magazine, but he was doing like a comics magazine during the days of Mouse.
Hmm.
And he came up to his printer and he was like, so we have these, a couple of different covers or something like that. And I might be misremembering the story, but it's fine. And he goes, we have a couple of these different covers and we want you to rip them apart during printing and reattach them in random order. And his printer was like, no, no. Um, so like that can be a thing. Like it doesn't have to even be about like strictly like objectionable content or anything like that. It can just be the fact that your creative voice might be really difficult to pull off and might be unreasonable to some people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I think that's what's so amazing about being a writer artist duo and creating comics is that
Mhm.
your voice has to mesh. Like your creative vision has to mesh. And it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be like, oh, we shake hands and our creatives are the same creative journeys. Like it's the same. Sometimes it does take compromise and conversation and like
Mhm.
working together, but being able to tell a story together is like a form of intimacy that I think is really cool. Like it's a work friendship bond that
Mhm.
me personally as someone who writes and draws comics and does not work with other people, I I admire it so much. And double the force of creativity, it really comes through when I
Yeah,
read Wood and Bones, I think. You can really hear your voices in harmony.
yeah. I remember when I was writing Gugel Guardian and I sent a couple of sample scripts over to Anya, the artist, and they come back and they're like, all right, I got the main character's design. I'm like, cool. And the lead character, Leo, has, like I was like, yeah, grimy, kind of disheveled, like a person is really tired. Here's a reference picture of me, so you can just like transplant me onto this character. And so they come back and they're like, oh, by the way, I added a bunch of um Russian bands because this character is Russian. So they're like, yeah, they seemed like they would like music a lot. And so I gave them a couple of good band T-shirts and a couple of really terrible Russian Nickelback ones, I'm told. And I was like, uh-huh.
Russian Nickelback. I want to listen so bad.
And I bring my roommate over who's Russian and Korean. And I'm like, look, take a look at this T-shirt that Leo's wearing. And he loves Leo, and he's like, and Russian Nickelback, And I'm like, I have no idea what this is, and I hadn't even mentioned like music to a huge degree, but like having kind of ruminated on it for like a couple of days, I'm like, let's roll with it. Like I'm not maybe not gonna write it huge parts into the story itself, right? But like, yeah, it's an
But it's
interesting,
flavor. It's visual
yeah,
flavor that yeah, yeah, it's so good.
yeah, and then you can kind of introduce that. Maybe it's at least part of the promotional art. Maybe you can do like cool ideas like music. I'm not gonna say that I want to do a slight solo with the characters in universe, but I totally wanna. Um, but
That's
like,
so good.
yeah, so it's that creative process because like it's not just like, can you make this? Can you draw this? It's here's this character. What do you think? Oh, I have these ideas. Oh, these ideas are great, and here's how I would develop them. And they're like, oh yeah, that's great. Like it's this bouncing ideas between each other. Um, and I think it's the same thing as writer artists do with editors, but on like a larger, more intimate scale.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. Well, we are just about out of time. Atla, where can people find you?
So they can only find me on Twitter and in my house. But you'd
Where
have to
would you
buy.
prefer they find you?
Oh,
In your
no, preferably not in my house. But so you can go on Atla the Writer on Twitter. You can also find me on my website, atlathewriter.com. And I, of course, also want to shout out our wonderful artist, Alexandra, um, who is on primarily on Instagram, uh, lexi.art with an E on the end. Like a true heavy metal person. And they also are doing a lot of tattoo work. They live in Sweden and have been doing a number of tattoo works, and they're beautiful. And one day I will get a tattoo from them. So definitely
Well,
also check them out on Instagram.
awesome. Okay. Well, that's gonna do it for us. Thank you so much. Check out Wooden Bones. The link is going to be just posted it in the chat. Available in the Hive Mill shop. And we're gonna wrap up here, but we will be back in about an hour with Queer Horror, and that's going to be with Ashley of Obelisk, along with Jackie Reynolds and G. Romero Johnson. And me. I'll be there too. So great. We will see you in just an hour. Bye.
Yeah, but before we go, buy my book.
Yeah, bye Atlas book. Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.